In the summer of 1847, when the Arizona Territory was still a wild and dangerous place where few white men dared to settle, a young rancher named Thomas Redfield made a decision that would change his life forever. He could not have known, as he stood on his porch that hot afternoon watching a strange figure approach from the desert, that this single moment would determine whether he lived or died, whether his ranch would become a graveyard or a home, whether his name would be forgotten or remembered for generations. What happened over the next several days would become one of the most remarkable stories of survival, compassion, and unlikely friendship in the history of the American frontier. It would be a story that old men would tell their grandchildren around campfires, a story that historians would write about in their books, a story that would prove once and for all that sometimes the smallest act of kindness can have consequences that stretch far beyond anything we can imagine. This is that story, and it begins with a cup of water given to a stranger when every instinct, every warning, every piece of advice Thomas had ever received told him to do the opposite. Thomas Redfield had come to Arizona from Missouri when he was just 22 years old. He was a tall man, broad in the shoulders, with hands that had been hardened by years of farm work back home. His father had died when Thomas was 17, leaving him to care for his mother and 3 younger sisters. He had worked that Missouri farm like a man possessed, waking before dawn and falling into bed long after the sun had set, trying to keep his family from starving. But the soil was tired, the crops were failing, and the bank was threatening to take everything. When his mother remarried and his sisters found husbands of their own, Thomas felt a restlessness in his soul that he could not explain. He heard stories of land out west, land that was free for the taking if a man was brave enough to claim it. He heard stories of cattle and horses, of fortunes made by men who had nothing but courage and determination. He also heard stories of the Apache, of raids and massacres, of settlers who had been found with their bodies mutilated beyond recognition. But Thomas was young, and the young do not believe in death, and so he packed everything he owned into a wagon and headed west. The journey had taken him nearly 4 months. He had traveled with a small group of other settlers at first, but one by one they had stopped along the way, some settling in Texas, others turning back when they saw the harsh reality of the frontier. By the time Thomas reached Arizona, he was alone. He found a valley that seemed perfect for ranching, a wide stretch of land with good grass, and a creek that ran through the middle of it. There were mountains on 3 sides, which would provide protection from the worst of the winter winds, and the land sloped gently down toward the south, which meant plenty of sun for growing whatever crops he might need. He built his house first, a simple structure made of adobe bricks that he formed himself from the red earth and dried in the sun. It took him 3 weeks to complete, working from dawn until dark every day. Then, he built a barn, smaller than he would have liked but big enough to shelter his horses through the worst weather. He built fences and dug a well and planted a garden. By the time he was finished, nearly 6 months had passed, and the valley that had been empty wilderness was beginning to look like a home. The other settlers in the territory had warned Thomas about his choice of location. The valley was beautiful, they said, but it was also deep in Apache country. The Chiricahua Apache had lived in these mountains for generations, and they did not take kindly to white men who came to steal their land. They told him about ranches that had been burned to the ground, about families who had been killed in their beds, about men who had been captured and tortured for days before being allowed to die. They told him to find land closer to the towns, where there were soldiers to protect him and neighbors who could come to his aid if trouble arose. But Thomas had seen that land, and it was already taken. The good spots were claimed, and what was left was rocky and dry and worthless for ranching. He had not come all this way to settle for scraps. So he thanked them for their advice and went to his valley anyway, and for the first year, everything was fine. He saw Apache from time to time, small groups of warriors crossing through the valley on their way to somewhere else. They never approached his ranch, and he never approached them. He kept his rifle loaded and within reach at all times, and he never let his guard down completely, but the attacks he had been warned about never came. He began to think that perhaps the other settlers had exaggerated the danger, that perhaps the Apache were not as hostile as everyone claimed. He started to relax, just a little. He spent less time looking over his shoulder and more time building his herd, buying cattle from other ranchers, and breeding his own horses. By the end of his 2nd year in the valley, he had nearly 100 head of cattle and a dozen good horses. He was not rich, not yet, but he was comfortable. He had everything he needed and most of what he wanted. He was even thinking about writing to a woman back in Missouri, a girl he had known growing up who had written to him twice since he left. Maybe it was time to start thinking about a family, about building something that would last beyond his own lifetime. It was during this time of contentment and hope that the stranger appeared. Thomas saw her from a long way off, a dark shape moving slowly across the desert toward his ranch. He grabbed his rifle and stepped out onto the porch, shading his eyes against the afternoon sun. At first he thought it was a man, perhaps a traveler who had gotten lost or whose horse had gone lame. But as the figure drew closer, he realized that something was wrong. The person was moving too slowly, stumbling and weaving as if drunk or sick. And there was something strange about the person's size, something that did not look quite right. Thomas watched for several minutes, his rifle ready, his heart beating faster in his chest. He knew he should go inside and bar the door. He knew he should prepare for whatever was coming. But something held him there on the porch, something he could not name, and he continued to watch as the stranger drew closer and closer. When she was perhaps 100 yards from the house, Thomas finally understood what he was seeing, and his breath caught in his throat. It was a woman, but not like any woman he had ever seen before. She was enormous, easily the tallest person Thomas had ever encountered, man or woman. She stood at least 6.5 feet tall, maybe more, and her shoulders were as broad as any man's. Her skin was dark, burned even darker by the sun, and her black hair hung in tangled ropes around her face. She was dressed in the traditional clothing of the Apache, a deerskin dress, and moccasins that reached to her knees. But what struck Thomas most was not her size or her clothing, but the condition she was in. She was clearly dying. The woman's face was gaunt with starvation, her cheeks sunken and her eyes hollow. Her lips were cracked and bleeding, and her skin had the gray pallor of someone who had gone too long without water. She moved like a person at the very end of her strength, each step an act of pure will. As Thomas watched, she stumbled and nearly fell, catching herself at the last moment and continuing forward. She did not seem to see the house or the man standing on the porch with a rifle in his hands. She seemed to see nothing at all, walking forward only because stopping would mean death, and her body had not yet given her permission to die. Thomas knew who she was. Not her name or her history, but what she was. She was Apache, and she was on his land, and every instinct he had developed over 2 years in this territory told him what to do. He should raise his rifle. He should point it at her and tell her to leave. Or he should simply let her pass, let her continue walking until the desert took her, and her death was on no one's conscience but her own and whatever god the Apache prayed to. He should not involve himself in whatever trouble had brought her to this state. He should think of his ranch and his cattle and his horses and the life he was building in this valley. He should think of all the stories he had heard, all the warnings he had been given. He should be smart. He should be careful. He should be like every other white man in this territory and see her not as a human being in desperate need, but as a threat to be eliminated or avoided. But Thomas Redfield was not like every other white man in the territory. He was not sure why, and he would spend the rest of his life trying to understand it. But something in him could not watch this woman die. Maybe it was the way his mother had raised him, with her constant reminders that every person was a child of God and deserving of compassion. Maybe it was the memory of his own desperation during those years after his father died, when kindness from neighbors had been the only thing standing between his family and starvation. Maybe it was simply that he was young and had not yet learned to harden his heart against the suffering of others. Whatever the reason, Thomas found himself setting down his rifle, stepping off the porch, and walking toward the woman who by every law of the frontier was his enemy. She did not seem to notice him until he was standing directly in front of her. When she finally raised her eyes to look at him, he saw something that he would never forget. There was no fear in those eyes, no anger, no pleading. There was only a deep and terrible exhaustion, the look of someone who had been through horrors beyond imagining and had nothing left to give. She looked at him the way a person looks at a tree or a rock, something that simply exists in the landscape without any particular meaning. She tried to speak, but no sound came from her cracked lips. Then her legs gave out, and she collapsed at his feet. Thomas acted without thinking. He lifted her in his arms, surprised at how light she was despite her great size. Starvation had taken so much from her that she weighed little more than a normal-sized woman in good health. He carried her into his house and laid her on his bed, The only bed he had, a simple frame with a straw mattress that he had built himself. He got water from the bucket by the fireplace and brought it to her lips, tilting her head up so she could drink. At first she could not swallow, the water just running out of her mouth and down her chin. But he was patient, giving her small sips and waiting for her to take them down. Slowly, drop by drop, she began to drink. It took nearly an hour before she could speak. Her voice was a harsh whisper, barely audible, and she spoke in Apache, which Thomas did not understand. But there was one word she said over and over, a word that sounded like a name, and he could hear the grief in her voice when she said it. She was mourning someone, he realized. Someone she had lost. He did not know the details, and might never know them, but he understood loss. He understood what it meant to have everything taken from you, and to be left with nothing but the memory of what had been. He sat beside her bed and held her hand, not knowing what else to do, and after a while she fell asleep. Thomas did not sleep that night. He sat in a chair by the window, his rifle across his knees, watching the darkness outside. He did not know what tomorrow would bring. He did not know if the woman in his bed would live or die, or if her people would come looking for her, or what they would do when they found her in a white man's house. He did not know if he had just signed his own death warrant by showing compassion to someone his neighbors would consider less than human. All he knew was that he had done what he believed was right, and whatever happened next, he would have to live with that decision. The woman's name, he would learn, was Lozen. She was not just any Apache woman, but the sister of a chief, a warrior in her own right who had fought beside the men of her tribe in battles against both the Mexicans and the Americans. She was known among her people as a woman of great power, a woman who could see the future and find enemies by the direction of her tingling palms. She was respected and feared, loved and honored, and her disappearance had caused great concern among the Chiricahua. But all of that would come later. For now, she was simply a dying woman in a stranger's bed, and Thomas was simply a man who had chosen mercy over fear. When morning came, Thomas went to check on his patient. She was awake, her dark eyes watching him as he entered the room. She looked better than she had the day before, though still terribly weak. The water had done its work, bringing some color back to her cheeks, and some clarity to her gaze. She tried to sit up, but did not have the strength, and Thomas gently pushed her back down, shaking his head. He pointed to himself, and said his name slowly and clearly, then pointed to her with a questioning look. She understood what he was asking. She placed her hand on her chest, and said a word that sounded like music, like wind through canyon walls, like something ancient and powerful. She said her name, and though Thomas did not know it at the time, she was giving him something precious, something that most white men would never receive from any Apache. Over the next several days, Thomas devoted himself to nursing Lozen back to health. He made broth from dried meat, and fed it to her spoonful by spoonful. He changed the water in her cup a dozen times a day, and made sure she drank as much as she could tolerate. He cleaned the wounds on her feet, which were torn and bleeding from walking for what must have been days across the rocky desert. He gave up his bed and slept on the floor by the fireplace, telling himself it was because he needed to be close to the door in case trouble came, but knowing in his heart that he simply wanted to be near enough to hear if she needed him during the night. He did not speak her language, and she did not speak his, but they found ways to communicate. She would point at something and say the Apache word, and he would say the English word, and slowly they began to build a vocabulary between them. It was not much, but it was enough. On the third day, Lozen was strong enough to sit up. On the fourth day, she could stand, though only for a few minutes at a time. On the fifth day, she walked to the door of the house and stood there looking out at the desert, at the mountains that rose in the distance, at the vast and empty landscape that was her home. Thomas watched her from inside, not wanting to intrude on whatever she was feeling. He saw her shoulders shake and realized she was crying, though she made no sound. He did not know what she had been through before she stumbled onto his ranch, but he knew it had been terrible. He knew that she had lost something, or someone, and that the grief of it was almost more than she could bear. That evening, she spoke to him for the first time in words he could understand. She had been listening to him talk over the past several days, memorizing the sounds and their meanings, and though her accent was heavy and her grammar uncertain, she could make herself understood. She told him thank you. She told him he had saved her life. She told him that among her people, such a debt could never be forgotten. She told him that she had been sent by her brother, a great chief whose name meant he who yawns in the white man's language, to scout the movements of Mexican soldiers to the south. But she had been caught in an ambush, her horse killed beneath her, and she had been forced to flee on foot with no water and no food. She had walked for 5 days before reaching his valley, surviving only because she refused to die before she could report what she had seen to her people. She had expected to find death in the desert. Instead, she had found him. Thomas listened to her story without interrupting. When she was finished, he nodded slowly. He told her that she was welcome to stay as long as she needed to recover her strength. He told her that he meant her no harm and would not try to stop her from leaving when she was ready. He told her that he had heard terrible things about the Apache, stories of violence and cruelty that had made him afraid when he first came to this valley. But he told her that he had also been raised to believe that every person deserved to be treated with dignity, and that he could not watch anyone suffer when it was in his power to help them. He told her these things simply and honestly, not knowing how she would react, not knowing if she would even understand him. Lozan was quiet for a long time after he finished speaking. She looked at him with those dark eyes that seemed to see right through him, that seemed to see things that ordinary people could not see. Then, she reached out and took his hand, holding it gently in both of hers. She said something in Apache that he did not understand, but he understood the tone. It was a blessing of some kind, a prayer or a promise. She held his hand for a long moment, and he felt something pass between them, something that had no name in any language. Then, she released him and turned away, and the moment was over. The next morning, everything changed. Thomas woke at dawn as usual and went outside to start his chores. The first thing he did every morning was check on his horses, making sure they had water and that none of them had gotten sick or injured during the night. He walked toward the barn, his mind already planning out the day's work, when he stopped suddenly and felt his blood turn to ice. There were men on the ridge above his valley. A lot of men. He squinted against the rising sun, trying to count them, trying to understand what he was seeing. They were Apache warriors, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, and they were completely surrounding his ranch. Thomas did not run. There was nowhere to run to. He did not reach for his rifle, which he had left in the house. There was no point in reaching for it. He simply stood there in his yard, watching as the warriors began to descend from the ridge, moving with a silence and grace that seemed impossible for so many men. They came from all directions, closing in on the ranch like the fingers of a giant hand. Thomas thought about Lozan, still sleeping inside his house. He thought about the stories he had heard, the warnings he had ignored. He thought about how his neighbors would react when they found his body, how they would shake their heads and say they had told him this would happen. He thought about all of these things, and he was afraid, but he did not let the fear show on his face. Whatever was going to happen, he would face it like a man. The warriors stopped about 50 yards from the house, forming a silent circle around it. They were armed with rifles and bows and lances, and their faces were painted for war. Thomas had never seen anything like it, this display of force and discipline and barely contained violence. He stood his ground and waited, knowing that his life now depended on whatever happened in the next few minutes. Then, a single rider emerged from the circle and rode slowly toward him. It was a man of perhaps 40 years, with a commanding presence and eyes that burned with intelligence. He stopped his horse a few feet from Thomas and looked down at him, studying him like a hawk studies a mouse. Then, he spoke, and his English was perfect, better than many of the settlers Thomas had met. "Where is she?" the man asked. "Where is my sister?" Thomas understood then what was happening. This was the chief Lozan had spoken of, her brother, the great leader whose name meant he who yawns. He had come looking for his sister with what must have been every warrior in his band, prepared to destroy anyone who had harmed her. Thomas felt his heart pounding in his chest, but he kept his voice steady when he answered. "She is inside," he said. "She is safe." The chief's eyes narrowed. He did not seem to believe him. He gestured to his warriors, and several of them dismounted and started toward the house. Thomas stepped in front of them, blocking their path. He did not know what he was doing. He did not know why he was risking his life for a woman he had known for less than a week. But something told him that if he showed weakness now, if he stepped aside and let them push past him, he would lose any chance of surviving this encounter. "She is recovering from her journey," Thomas said, his voice louder now so that everyone could hear. "She was near death when she came to me. I have been caring for her. She is not a prisoner. She is a guest in my home." The warriors hesitated, looking back at their chief for guidance. The chief stared at Thomas for a long moment, and Thomas could see him calculating, weighing the possibilities. Then, a voice came from behind Thomas, a woman's voice, speaking in rapid Apache. He turned and saw Lozen standing in the doorway of his house. She was still weak, leaning against the frame for support, but her voice was strong and clear as she spoke to her brother. Thomas did not understand the words, but he understood the effect they had. The tension in the air began to ease. The warriors who had been advancing toward the house stopped and stepped back. The chief's expression changed from suspicion to something like wonder. Lozen spoke for several minutes, gesturing toward Thomas, toward the house, toward the mountains. When she finished, there was a long silence. Then, the chief dismounted from his horse and walked toward Thomas. He stopped directly in front of him, so close that Thomas could see the fine lines around his eyes and the silver in his hair. The chief was silent for a moment, studying Thomas's face. Then, he did something that Thomas would never have expected. He smiled. "My sister tells me that you saved her life," the chief said. "She tells me that you gave her water when she was dying of thirst, food when she was starving, shelter when she had none. She tells me that you treated her with respect and kindness, that you asked nothing in return, that you did not even try to learn information that could have been valuable to your people. She tells me that you are a good man." Thomas did not know what to say. He had not expected kindness in return. He had expected death, or at best a grudging acknowledgement before the warriors rode away. He had not expected this chief, this legendary leader of one of the most feared warrior bands in the Southwest, to stand before him and speak to him like an equal. The chief continued, "Among my people, we have a saying. A life saved is a debt that can never be fully repaid. But we try. You have given my sister back to me. You have given our people back one of our greatest warriors. This cannot be forgotten." He reached out and placed his hand on Thomas's shoulder. His grip was strong, and his eyes held Thomas's without wavering. "From this day forward," the chief said, "you are under the protection of the Chiricahua Apache. No warrior of my band will ever harm you or your property. If you are in danger, you need only send word, and we will come to your aid. Your enemies are now our enemies. Your friends are now our friends. This is my promise to you, and the promise of a chief is sacred." Thomas finally found his voice. He thanked the chief, trying to express what he was feeling but knowing that words were inadequate. The chief nodded, seeming to understand. Then, he turned and walked back to his horse. He mounted in one smooth motion and looked back at Thomas one last time. "Take care of yourself, white man," he said. There was a hint of humor in his voice now, a warmth that Thomas had not heard before. "The world is dangerous, and there are many who would not have shown my sister the kindness that you did. But remember this day. Remember that there is honor in compassion and strength in mercy. Remember that sometimes the greatest warriors are not those who kill the most enemies, but those who make the most friends." He raised his hand in a gesture of farewell, and then he was riding away, back toward the ridge where his warriors waited. One by one, the other riders fell in behind him, until the circle that had surrounded the ranch was broken and the valley was empty again. Thomas stood watching them go, hardly believing what had just happened. He felt Lozen come to stand beside him, and together they watched until the last warrior had disappeared over the ridge, and there was nothing left but the dust settling in their wake. Lozen stayed at the ranch for 3 more days, recovering her strength and preparing for her journey back to her people. During that time, she and Thomas talked for hours, sharing stories of their lives and their families and their hopes for the future. Thomas learned about the Apache way of life, about their beliefs and their customs and their struggles against the whites and the Mexicans who wanted to take their land. Lozen learned about Thomas's life in Missouri, about his father's death and his mother's remarriage and his long journey west. They became friends, true friends, despite all the barriers of language and culture and history that should have kept them apart. On the morning of her departure, Lozen gave Thomas a gift. It was a small medicine bag, made of leather and decorated with beads and feathers. Inside was a stone, smooth and white, that she had carried with her for many years. She told him it had been given to her by a holy man when she was young, that it was supposed to protect the person who carried it from harm. She wanted him to have it. She wanted him to remember her and the days they had spent together in this valley that had become, briefly, a bridge between 2 worlds. Thomas accepted the gift with gratitude and gave her one in return. It was a pocket knife, the one possession he had carried with him all the way from Missouri. His father had given it to him on his 10th birthday, and he had kept it with him every day since. It was not much, but it was all he had that meant anything. Lozen seemed to understand. She took the knife and held it against her heart, and when she looked up at him, there were tears in her eyes. Then, she was gone, walking across the desert toward the mountains where her people waited. Thomas watched her until she was out of sight, a tall, proud figure growing smaller and smaller against the vast landscape. And he knew, as he watched her go, that his life would never be the same again. The weeks following Lozen's departure were among the strangest in Thomas Redfield's life. On the surface, nothing had changed. He still woke at dawn to tend to his horses and cattle. He still repaired fences and worked his garden and did all the countless small tasks that kept a frontier ranch running. He still ate his meals alone and slept alone and spent his evenings reading by lamplight from the small collection of books he had brought from Missouri. From the outside, his life looked exactly as it had before that fateful afternoon when a dying woman had stumbled into his valley. But inside, everything was different. He had been changed by what happened, changed in ways he was only beginning to understand. For one thing, he was no longer alone. Oh, he was still the only person living on his ranch, the only human being for miles in any direction. But he no longer felt the isolation that had sometimes pressed down on him during his first 2 years in the valley. He knew now that there were people out there who cared about him, people who would come to his aid if he needed them. The promise the chief had made was not an empty one. Thomas understood that with a certainty that went beyond words. He had seen something in the chief's eyes when he made that promise, a quality of honor and integrity that Thomas recognized because his own father had possessed it. When a man like that gave his word, it was as solid as the mountains that surrounded the valley. Thomas was no longer alone because he had made friends in the most unlikely of places. For another thing, he had stopped being afraid. Not completely, of course. Only a fool would live on the frontier without any fear at all. But the constant low-level anxiety that had been his companion since he arrived in Arizona was gone. He no longer woke in the middle of the night at every small sound, reaching for his rifle and lying awake for hours waiting for an attack that never came. He no longer watched the ridges with that particular tension that came from expecting to see warriors at any moment. He had faced the thing he feared most, and it had not destroyed him. Instead, it had become his protector. There was a strange freedom in that, a lightness that made every day feel a little bit brighter than it had before. Word spread quickly through the territory about what had happened at Thomas Redfield's ranch. In a land where news traveled slowly and was often exaggerated beyond recognition, the story of the white man who had saved an Apache warrior and earned the protection of one of the most feared chiefs in the Southwest became something like a legend. Thomas heard the story repeated back to him by traders and travelers, and he barely recognized the events as they were described. In some versions, he had single-handedly fought off a war party before nursing Lozen back to health. In others, he had magical powers that allowed him to communicate with the Apache through dreams. In still others, he was actually half Apache himself, which explained why he had shown compassion to one of them. Thomas tried to correct these stories when he heard them, but it was like trying to stop a river with his bare hands. The legend had taken on a life of its own. The other settlers in the territory had mixed reactions to his newfound status. Some were impressed, even envious. They saw the practical advantages of having Apache protection and wondered if there was some way they could achieve the same thing for themselves. These were mostly the newer arrivals, people who had not yet developed the deep hatred for the native peoples that characterized so many of the old-timers. They came to Thomas's ranch asking for advice, wanting to know how they could establish friendly relations with the Apache bands in their areas. Thomas told them the truth, that he had not done anything strategic or calculated, that he had simply helped a person in need without thinking about the consequences. They seemed disappointed by this answer, as if they had been hoping for some secret formula they could apply to their own situations. Others were less friendly. There were men in the territory who hated the Apache with a passion that bordered on madness, men who had lost family members or friends to raids, men who believed that the only good Indian was a dead Indian. These men saw Thomas as a traitor, a man who had given aid and comfort to the enemy. They whispered about him in the trading posts and saloons, calling him names that Thomas preferred not to repeat. A few of them tried to make trouble for him, riding onto his land uninvited and making vague threats about what happened to Indian lovers in this part of the country. But they always rode away again, because even the bravest of them was not willing to risk the wrath of the Chiricahua Apache over a personal grudge. The protection the chief had promised was already proving its worth. As the months passed, Thomas began to establish regular contact with Lozen's band. It started with a single visit, about 3 months after she had left his ranch. A young warrior appeared at the edge of the valley one morning, making himself visible on the ridge in a way that Thomas understood was deliberate. Thomas rode out to meet him, unarmed except for the knife at his belt, and the warrior handed him a message. It was from Lozen, written in halting English that she must have learned from someone in her tribe. She wanted Thomas to know that she was well, that she had recovered fully from her ordeal, and that she thought of him often. She also wanted to warn him that there was talk among some of the other Apache bands about raiding the white settlements, and that he should be careful in the coming weeks. Thomas thanked the warrior and gave him a gift to take back to Lozen, a new wool blanket from his store of trading goods. The warrior nodded solemnly and rode away, and Thomas felt the connection between himself and the Apache grow a little bit stronger. These visits became a regular occurrence. Every few weeks, a messenger would appear on the ridge, and Thomas would ride out to receive news from the Chiricahua and to send news back. Sometimes the messages were practical, warnings about military movements or information about game trails and water sources. Sometimes they were more personal, stories about life in the Apache camps or questions about Thomas's own life and work. Through these exchanges, Thomas began to learn the Apache language, slowly building his vocabulary until he could communicate basic ideas without the need for translation. He also began to learn about Apache culture in a way that few white men ever had the opportunity to do. He learned about their religious beliefs, their social structure, their history of resistance against first the Spanish, then the Mexicans, and now the Americans who wanted to take their land. He learned about the complexities of Apache politics, the rivalries between different bands and leaders, the debates about whether to make peace with the whites or to fight them until the last warrior was dead. He learned to see the world through different eyes, and what he saw was both beautiful and terrifying. The chief himself came to visit Thomas once, about 6 months after that first encounter. He arrived with only 2 warriors, a small party that seemed almost humble compared to the army he had brought before. But Thomas understood that this was a sign of respect, an acknowledgement that he was not someone who needed to be intimidated. The chief stayed for 3 days, and during that time, the 2 men talked for hours about everything from ranching techniques to philosophy to the uncertain future of both their peoples. Thomas found the chief to be one of the most intelligent and thoughtful men he had ever met, a man who understood the realities of the situation facing his people, but who refused to give up hope for a better outcome. The chief in turn seemed to find Thomas an interesting puzzle, a white man who did not fit the mold of the soldiers and settlers he had known before. By the time the chief left, their relationship had evolved from one of formal alliance to something more like friendship. It was during the chief's visit that Thomas first heard about the problems that were brewing in the territory. The Mexican government had put a bounty on Apache scalps, paying 100 pesos for the scalp of a warrior, 50 for a woman, and 25 for a child. This policy had led to the rise of scalp hunters, gangs of vicious men who roamed the border region killing any Apache they could find and collecting the bounty. But the Mexicans could not always tell Apache scalps from those of other indigenous peoples, or even from the scalps of Mexicans with dark hair, which meant that the scalp hunters had no incentive to be selective about their victims. Some of them had even crossed into American territory, hunting Apache who had treaties with the United States government. The situation was becoming increasingly dangerous, and the chief was worried that it would lead to a wider war. Thomas listened to this news with growing concern. He had heard rumors about the scalp hunters, but had not realized how serious the problem had become. The chief explained that his own band had lost several people to these raids, including women and children who had been caught while gathering food away from the main camp. The survivors were demanding revenge, and it was becoming harder and harder for the chief to counsel patience. If something did not change soon, the chief feared that his warriors would begin to attack American settlements indiscriminately, unable to distinguish between those who were responsible for the violence and those who were innocent. And if that happened, the army would respond in force, and the result would be a war that the Apache could not win. Thomas asked what he could do to help. The chief looked at him for a long time before answering. There were things that Thomas could do, he said finally, things that no Apache could do. Thomas was white. He could travel freely through American territory. He could go to the towns and the trading posts and the military forts. He could speak to the authorities, tell them what was happening, try to convince them to take action against the scalp hunters. The Apache had no voice in the world of the whites. But Thomas did. If he was willing to use it, he might be able to prevent the bloodshed that both of them dreaded. Thomas agreed without hesitation. He did not know if he could make any difference, but he knew he had to try. For the next several weeks, he rode from settlement to settlement, speaking to anyone who would listen about the danger posed by the scalp hunters. He talked to sheriffs and judges and military officers. He talked to merchants and ranchers and ordinary citizens. He explained the situation as clearly as he could, emphasizing that the continued hunting of Apache on American soil could lead to attacks on American settlers, attacks that could be prevented if the authorities would simply enforce the laws that already existed. Most of the people he spoke to were skeptical at first, suspicious of any white man who seemed to sympathize with the Indians. But Thomas had developed a reputation by this point, and his word carried weight. Slowly, reluctantly, some of them began to listen. The turning point came when Thomas managed to secure a meeting with a colonel who commanded the military forces in the region. The colonel was a career soldier named Harrison, a stern man with gray hair and cold blue eyes who had spent 20 years fighting on various frontiers. He had no particular love for the Apache, but he was a practical man who understood that pointless wars were bad for everyone, including the army. Thomas laid out the situation as he understood it, explaining the grievances of the Apache and the danger that the scalp hunters posed to the peace. The colonel listened without interrupting, his face giving nothing away. When Thomas finished, there was a long silence. Finally, the colonel spoke. He said that he had been hearing reports about the scalp hunters for some time, but he had not realized the extent of the problem. He said that he would send patrols to the border region with orders to arrest any scalp hunters they found operating on American soil. He could not guarantee that this would solve the problem, but it was a start. He also said that he would send word to the Mexican authorities, requesting that they discontinue the bounty policy that was causing so much trouble. Again, he could not guarantee results, but he would try. Thomas thanked him profusely and rode back to his ranch with a sense of accomplishment that he had rarely felt before. The colonel was true to his word. Within a month, army patrols had captured 3 separate bands of scalp hunters, confiscating their weapons and holding them for trial. The message spread quickly through the criminal underworld that the American military was no longer turning a blind eye to the hunting of Apache on its territory. The raids did not stop completely, but they decreased significantly. More importantly, the chief was able to use this development to calm the more aggressive elements in his band. He could point to concrete action being taken and argue that patience was being rewarded. The immediate crisis passed, and a wider war was averted. Thomas's role in this outcome did not go unnoticed. The Apaches saw him as a bridge between their world and the world of the whites, someone who could speak on their behalf in places where they would never be heard. The chief began to consult with him regularly on matters involving the Americans, seeking his advice on how to navigate the complex and often treacherous waters of white politics. Thomas did his best to help, using his knowledge of both cultures to find solutions that worked for everyone. It was not always easy, and there were many failures along the way. But there were also successes, small victories that added up over time to something like progress. Among the white settlers, Thomas's reputation became even more complicated. Those who had been impressed by his Apache protection now saw him as a genuine peacemaker, someone who was working to prevent the violence that everyone feared. But those who had hated him before hated him even more now. To them, he was not just an Indian lover, but an Indian advocate, someone who was actively working against the interests of his own people. The threats against him became more frequent and more serious. One night, someone set fire to one of his outbuildings, destroying a season's worth of hay. Another night, someone shot his best horse as it grazed in the pasture. Thomas reported these incidents to the sheriff in the nearest town, but the sheriff was one of those who viewed him with suspicion, and nothing was ever done. Thomas was learning the price of standing between two worlds, belonging fully to neither. Through all of this, his friendship with Lozen continued to deepen. She came to visit him several times over the following year, sometimes staying for days at a time. They would sit on his porch in the evenings, watching the sun set over the mountains, talking about everything and nothing. She told him about her childhood, about learning to ride and shoot and track, about the ceremonies that had marked her transition from girl to woman. She told him about her gift, her ability to sense the presence of enemies by the tingling in her palms, a gift that had saved her life, and the lives of her people many times. She told him about the battles she had fought, the enemies she had killed, the friends she had lost. And she told him about her deepest fear, that her people were fighting a war they could not win, that everything she loved was destined to be swept away by the tide of white settlement that seemed unstoppable. Thomas listened to her stories and shared his own in return. He told her about growing up in Missouri, about the rhythm of farm life and the changing of the seasons. He told her about his father, a quiet, strong man who had taught him everything he knew about honor and hard work and treating people with respect. He told her about his mother, a gentle woman with a fierce devotion to her family who had somehow found the strength to rebuild her life after her husband's death. He told her about his sisters, now scattered across the country with families of their own, people he might never see again. And he told her about his own fears, that he would die alone in this valley, that everything he was building would amount to nothing in the end. In these conversations, they found common ground despite all their differences. They were both people who valued loyalty and courage. They both understood sacrifice. They both knew what it meant to be caught between worlds, to be seen as strange or suspicious by those around them. Thomas had never met anyone like Lozen, and he suspected he never would again. She was one of the most remarkable human beings he had ever encountered, a warrior and a healer, a prophet and a friend. He did not fall in love with her, not in the romantic sense that the word usually implied. But he loved her nonetheless, with a deep and abiding affection that would last for the rest of his life. As the second year since their first meeting drew to a close, Thomas noticed a change in Lozen's demeanor. She seemed worried in a way she had not been before, distracted during their conversations, her eyes constantly scanning the horizon as if looking for something she dreaded to see. When he asked her what was wrong, she was reluctant to answer at first. But eventually she told him. The peace that they had worked so hard to maintain was beginning to crumble. New settlers were arriving in the territory every day, and they were pushing into lands that had been promised to the Apache in treaties that the American government seemed to have forgotten. There had been skirmishes, small fights between Apache hunting parties, and white settlers who claimed the Apache were trespassing on their land. Some of these skirmishes had turned deadly. The chief was doing everything he could to prevent a wider conflict, but his authority was being challenged by younger warriors who believed that fighting was the only answer. Thomas asked what he could do. Lozen shook her head sadly. There was nothing he could do, she said. Nothing anyone could do. The forces at play were too big, too powerful, too relentless. The white men wanted the land, and they would not stop until they had taken all of it. The Apache would fight, because that was their nature and their right, but in the end they would lose. It was only a matter of time. She said this without bitterness, without self-pity, stating it as a simple fact. And Thomas, looking into her eyes, saw that she had accepted this truth in a way that he himself could not. She was preparing herself for the end, whenever it came. But she also said something else, something that Thomas would remember for the rest of his life. She said that even though they would lose the war, that did not mean that everything they did was meaningless. Every life saved was a victory. Every day of peace was a victory. Every moment of connection between people who should have been enemies was a victory. The war might be lost, but the battle for dignity, for humanity, for the soul of both their peoples, was still being fought. And as long as that battle continued, there was reason to hope. Thomas took her words to heart. He had been feeling increasingly helpless in the face of the gathering storm, wondering if anything he did really mattered. But Lozen's words reminded him that meaning was not measured by outcomes alone. The choice to be compassionate, to be just, to be brave, was its own reward, regardless of what happened afterward. Thomas resolved to continue doing what he had been doing, helping where he could, speaking out when he could, standing as a bridge between worlds even if that bridge was destined to collapse. It was all any person could do, and it was enough. The season changed, and then changed again. Thomas's ranch prospered despite the troubles around him. His herd grew larger, his horses stronger, his garden more productive. He added a second room to his house, and improved the barn, and built a proper smokehouse for preserving meat. He was becoming something he had never imagined when he left Missouri, a man of substance, a man with a stake in this land and its future. But even as his personal fortunes rose, the situation in the territory grew darker. The skirmishes became more frequent. The rhetoric on both sides became more heated. War was coming. Everyone could feel it. And when it came, Thomas knew that his unique position would become increasingly difficult to maintain. Then came the news that changed everything. A rider appeared at the edge of Thomas's valley one evening. Not a Chiricahua messenger, but a white man, a soldier in the uniform of the United States Army. He brought a letter from Colonel Harrison, the officer Thomas had spoken to about the scalp hunters. The letter contained terrible news. A rogue cavalry unit had attacked an Apache camp in the mountains, killing dozens of people, including women and children. The attack had been unauthorized, carried out by an officer who had ignored his orders in pursuit of personal glory. But the damage was done. The Apache were demanding justice, and if they did not get it, they would take matters into their own hands. The colonel wanted Thomas to come to the fort immediately. There might still be a chance to prevent a catastrophe, but only if someone could speak to the Apache, someone they trusted. Thomas was the only person who fit that description. Thomas read the letter twice, his heart sinking with each word. He thought of Lozin and her people, of the chief and his warriors, of all the work they had done to maintain the fragile peace. And he thought of what would happen if that peace collapsed, the blood that would be spilled on both sides, the lives that would be lost, the wounds that would never heal. He did not hesitate. He saddled his horse and rode through the night, arriving at the fort just as the sun was rising over the eastern mountains. He did not know if he could save the peace, but he knew he had to try. The military fort was a grim place, all dust and sweat and barely contained violence. Thomas rode through the gates just as the morning bugle was sounding, his horse exhausted from the long night's ride. Soldiers stopped what they were doing to stare at him as he passed, their faces a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. Word of his reputation had spread even here, and he could tell from their expressions that opinions were divided. Some saw him as a valuable asset, a man who could communicate with the Apache in ways that no military officer could. Others saw him as a traitor, a white man who had betrayed his own kind by befriending the enemy. Thomas ignored them all and headed directly for the colonel's quarters. Colonel Harrison was waiting for him. The officer looked older than when Thomas had last seen him, the lines on his face deeper, the gray in his hair more pronounced. The burden of command in this troubled territory was clearly taking its toll. He rose from behind his desk when Thomas entered and extended his hand, which Thomas shook firmly. There was genuine warmth in the colonel's greeting, but also a deep weariness that spoke of sleepless nights and impossible decisions. "Thank you for coming," the colonel said. "I know it was a long ride." Thomas nodded. "Tell me everything." The colonel gestured to a chair, and Thomas sat. For the next hour, the colonel laid out the situation in painful detail. The attack on the Apache camp had occurred 5 days ago, deep in the mountains where the Chiricahua had made their winter camp. A cavalry unit under the command of a Captain James Morrison had been sent on a routine patrol when they stumbled across evidence of the camp. Morrison, a young officer hungry for glory and promotion, had decided to attack without authorization. He had divided his force and approached the camp from 2 directions just before dawn, when most of the Apache were still sleeping. The attack had been swift and brutal. By the time it was over, more than 40 Apache were dead, most of them women and children. The warriors had been away on a hunting expedition and had returned to find their families slaughtered. Thomas listened with growing horror. He thought of the camp he had visited, the children playing between the wickiups, the women grinding corn and tanning hides, the elders sitting in the shade and telling stories of the old days. He thought of Lozin and wondered if she had been there when the attack came. The colonel saw the question in his eyes and shook his head. "She was with the hunting party," he said. "She survived. But her brother, the chief, lost his wife and his 2 youngest children in the attack. He is not in a forgiving mood." Thomas closed his eyes and felt the weight of what had happened settle onto his shoulders. He understood now why the colonel had sent for him. The chief had trusted him, had seen him as a friend and an ally. If there was anyone who could approach the chief in his grief and rage and have any hope of being heard, it was Thomas. But Thomas also understood the magnitude of what he was being asked to do. He was being asked to convince a man who had just lost his family to stay his hand, to accept justice through the white man's system rather than taking his own revenge. It seemed almost impossible. "What happened to Morrison?" Thomas asked. The colonel's face darkened. "He has been arrested and will face a court-martial. He disobeyed direct orders, and his actions have endangered the entire territory. If I have anything to say about it, he will hang." Thomas nodded slowly. That was something, at least. It would not bring back the dead, but it was something. "And the other soldiers?" he asked. "The ones who participated in the attack. They have also been arrested," the colonel said. "They were following orders from their commanding officer. so their culpability is different. But they will face consequences as well. I give you my word on that. Thomas sat in silence for a long moment, thinking. The colonel's words were good, but words were cheap. The Apache would want to see action, not just promises. They would want to see the man who had killed their families brought to justice, and they would want to see it quickly. The military justice system was slow and cumbersome, designed for a world where order and procedure mattered more than speed. In the world of the Apache, justice was swift and personal. A man who killed your family would be dead within days, if not hours. The gap between these two approaches to justice was vast, and bridging it would be extremely difficult. I will try, Thomas said finally. But I cannot promise anything. The chief is a reasonable man, but he is also a father who just lost his children. There is no guarantee that reason will win out over grief. I understand, the colonel said. All I ask is that you try. Thomas rode out from the fort that same morning, heading into the mountains where the Apache were gathering. The colonel had offered him an escort, but Thomas refused. If he appeared with soldiers at his back, the Apache would see it as a threat, not a peace mission. He had to go alone, with nothing but his horse and his reputation to protect him. It was dangerous, he knew. The Apache were not in a mood to welcome any white man, no matter how good his relations with them had been in the past. But it was the only way. The ride took 2 days. Thomas pushed his horse as hard as he dared, stopping only when the animal needed rest, eating cold food from his saddlebags without bothering to make a fire. He slept for a few hours on the first night, lying on the hard ground with his saddle for a pillow, staring up at the stars until exhaustion pulled him under. His dreams were troubled, full of fire and blood and the screaming of children. He woke before dawn and continued on, his heart heavy with dread. On the second day, they found him. He was crossing a narrow canyon when warriors appeared on the rocks above him, their bows drawn, their faces painted for war. Thomas stopped his horse and raised his hands, showing that he was unarmed. He called out in Apache, identifying himself and stating his purpose. For a long moment, nothing happened. Thomas could feel their eyes on him, could feel their hatred and their grief pressing down on him like a physical weight. He had never felt so alone in his life. Then, a voice called out from the rocks, a voice he recognized. It was Lozan. She appeared on a ledge above him, looking down at him with an expression he could not read. Her face was painted for mourning, black streaks running down her cheeks, and her hair was cut short, a sign of grief among her people. She said something to the warriors, and they lowered their bows. Then, she began to climb down from the rocks, moving with the grace and agility that had always characterized her despite her great size. She did not embrace him when she reached the floor of the canyon. There was a distance in her manner that had not been there before, a coldness that Thomas understood even if it hurt him. She had lost people in the attack, people she loved. And Thomas, no matter how much he had done for her people, was still white. He was still one of them, still connected by blood and skin to the men who had slaughtered her family. You should not have come, she said. I had to, Thomas replied. There might still be a chance to prevent more bloodshed. Lozan shook her head. The time for prevention is over. The time for blood has come. Thomas felt his heart sink, but he pressed on. The soldiers who did this will be punished, he said. Their commander will be executed. The colonel gave me his word. Lozan laughed, but there was no humor in it. The word of a white man, she said. We have heard such words before. Treaties signed, and then broken. Promises made, and then forgotten. Why should we believe this time will be different? Thomas had no answer for that. She was right. The history between their peoples was a history of broken promises and betrayed trust. But he had to try anyway. Let me speak to your brother, he said. Let me tell him what the colonel promised. Let him decide for himself. Lozan studied him for a long moment. Thomas could see her wrestling with something, some internal conflict that was playing out behind her dark eyes. Finally, she nodded. You may speak to him, she said. But I cannot promise he will listen. And I cannot promise you will leave this place alive. Thomas nodded. He had known the risks when he came. He would accept whatever happened. They rode for several more hours, climbing higher into the mountains until the air grew thin and cold. Thomas saw signs of the Apache camp long before they reached it, warriors moving through the trees, watching them from a distance. The word of his arrival had spread ahead of them, and by the time they reached the main camp, it seemed like the entire band had gathered to see him. Thomas saw anger in their faces, hatred, grief. He saw some who looked at him with what might have been hope, and others who looked at him with open contempt. He ignored them all and focused on the figure waiting for him at the center of the camp. The chief stood alone in front of what had been his family's wickiup. The structure had been torn down, its poles scattered on the ground, its covering burned to ash. This was the Apache way of mourning, Thomas knew, the destruction of everything that had belonged to the dead. The chief was wearing his war paint, his face a mask of red and black, and in his hand he held a rifle. He did not raise it as Thomas approached, but he did not lower it either. His eyes were empty, hollowed out by a grief so profound that it had left nothing behind. Thomas dismounted and walked toward the chief, acutely aware that every person in the camp was watching him. He stopped about 10 feet away, close enough to speak, but far enough to show respect. The silence stretched between them, heavy and terrible. Thomas did not know how to begin. Everything he had planned to say suddenly seemed inadequate, meaningless in the face of such loss. The chief spoke first. "Why have you come?" Thomas took a deep breath. "I came because I heard what happened. I came because I grieve for your loss. And I came because I hope that there might still be a way to prevent more death." The chief's expression did not change. "My wife is dead," he said. "My children are dead. Dozens of my people are dead. And you speak to me of preventing death." Thomas nodded. "I know. I know that nothing I can say will bring them back. But the men who did this are going to be punished. Their commander will be executed. The soldiers who followed his orders will face justice. The colonel himself told me this, and I believe him." The chief laughed, the same bitter, humorless laugh that Lozin had given. "Justice," he said. "Is that what you call it when white men judge other white men for killing Indians? I have seen this justice before. A trial that lasts for months. Lawyers who argue about laws that were written by white men for white men. A verdict that is always somehow lenient, somehow merciful. And, in the end, the murderers go free, and my people are still dead." Thomas had no answer. He knew the chief was not wrong. He had seen the same thing happen before, had heard the stories of trials that ended in acquittals, and sentences that were reduced, and murderers who walked free while their victims rotted in unmarked graves. The white man's justice was not designed for Indians. It never had been. But what is the alternative? Thomas asked. War. You know what that will mean. The army has thousands of soldiers. They have rifles and cannons and supplies that will last for years. You have a few hundred warriors. You could win some battles, but you cannot win the war. And when the war is over, your people will be dead or scattered. Everything you have built, everything you have fought for, will be destroyed. The chief stared at him. "And you think that matters to me now?" he asked. "You think I care about the future when my children lie in the ground? You think I care about anything except making the white men pay for what they have done?" Thomas understood. He truly did. If someone had killed his family, he would feel the same way. He would want revenge, would want to make the murderers suffer as he was suffering. It was a natural human response, perhaps the most natural response there was. But he also knew that giving in to that response would only lead to more death, more suffering, more grief. It was a cycle that had been repeating for centuries, and it would continue to repeat until someone found the courage to break it. "I cannot tell you what to do," Thomas said. "I have no right to tell a father how to grieve for his children. But I can tell you what I have learned in my life. Revenge does not bring peace. It does not fill the emptiness inside you. It does not bring the dead back to life. It only creates more emptiness, more dead, more grief. The men who killed your family will face justice, one way or another. If the white man's courts do not punish them, then God will. But if you go to war, you will be doing exactly what they want you to do. You will be giving them an excuse to wipe your people off the face of the earth." The chief was silent for a long moment. Thomas could see him thinking, could see the war raging inside him between his grief and his reason. It was the hardest kind of battle, the kind that no one else could fight for you. Thomas waited, hardly daring to breathe. Finally, the chief spoke. "You asked me to trust the white man's justice," he said. "You asked me to believe that the men who murdered my family will be punished. But why should I trust anything you say? You are one of them. Your skin is white. Your language is their language. Your God is their God. Why should I believe that you are any different?" Thomas thought about the question. It was the same question he had been asking himself for years. Why was he different? Why had he chosen to save Lozin when any other white man in the territory would have let her die? Why had he devoted himself to building a bridge between two peoples when most of his own kind saw the Apache as less than human? He did not know the answer. He had never known the answer. But he knew what he believed. "I cannot explain why I am the way I am," he said. "I only know that when I saw Lozin dying in my yard, I could not let her die. I only know that when I learned about the suffering of your people, I could not stay silent. I only know that when I look at you, I do not see an enemy. I see a father who has lost his children. I see a leader who is trying to protect his people. I see a man who is facing an impossible choice. And I see myself, because if our situations were reversed, I do not know that I would be any different. The chief stared at him for a long moment. Thomas could not tell what he was thinking. Then, slowly, the chief lowered his rifle and set it on the ground. He walked toward Thomas until they were standing face to face, close enough that Thomas could see the tears that had dried on his cheeks, the bloodshot redness of his eyes, the trembling in his hands that he was trying so hard to control. I will give you one chance, the chief said. I will wait and see if the white man's justice is real. If the murderer is executed, as you say he will be, then I will hold back my warriors. But if he is not, if he is allowed to go free, then there will be war. And when that war comes, I will not spare anyone. Not the soldiers, not the settlers, not even you. Do you understand? Thomas nodded. He understood. He understood that he had just bet his life on the word of a man he barely knew, a colonel who might or might not be able to keep his promise. He understood that if the court-martial failed, if Morrison was acquitted or given a light sentence, then Thomas would die along with everyone else in the territory. But he also understood that there was no other choice. This was the only hope for peace, the only chance to prevent the bloodshed that both sides would regret. I understand, he said, and I thank you for giving us this chance. The chief nodded curtly and turned away, walking toward the ruins of his home. Thomas watched him go, feeling a strange mixture of hope and despair. He had bought time, but he had not solved anything. Everything now depended on the court-martial, on whether justice would be served or denied. And that was something Thomas had no control over. He stayed in the Apache camp for 3 days at the chief's invitation. It was a strange and uncomfortable time. Many of the Apache treated him with open hostility, refusing to speak to him or even acknowledge his presence. Others were more welcoming, seeming to understand that he was trying to help. Lozen was somewhere in between. She did not avoid him, but neither did she seek him out. When they did speak, there was a barrier between them that had not been there before, a wall built from grief and suspicion that Thomas did not know how to breach. On the 3rd day, he rode out of the camp and headed back toward the territory. He had a lot of work to do. He needed to speak with the colonel again, to make sure that the court-martial proceeded as promised. He needed to gather support from other settlers, from anyone who might be able to put pressure on the military to do the right thing. He needed to prepare for the possibility that his efforts would fail, that war would come despite everything he had done. It was an overwhelming task, but Thomas had never been one to shrink from hard work. The weeks that followed were some of the most difficult of his life. He spent most of his time traveling between settlements and military forts, talking to anyone who would listen, trying to build support for justice. He wrote letters to newspaper editors, to politicians, to anyone he thought might have influence. He spoke at town meetings and church services, telling the story of what had happened and arguing that punishing the guilty was the only way to prevent a wider war. Some people listened and were moved. Others laughed in his face and told him to mind his own business. A few threatened him openly, warning him that Indian lovers had a way of meeting unfortunate ends in this territory. Through it all, Thomas kept in touch with the Apache through his network of messengers. He sent word of his efforts, letting the chief know that he was doing everything in his power to ensure justice. The chief sent word back, acknowledging his efforts, but making it clear that words were not enough. The deadline was approaching. If the murderer was not punished soon, the war would begin. Finally, the day of the court-martial arrived. Thomas rode to the fort and took a seat in the back of the room where the trial would be held. The room was packed with soldiers and settlers, all of them eager to see what would happen. Captain Morrison was brought in under guard, his face pale but defiant. He did not seem to understand the gravity of what he had done, or perhaps he simply did not care. He looked around the room with an expression of contempt, as if the whole proceeding was beneath him. The trial lasted for 3 days. Witnesses were called, evidence was presented, arguments were made. Thomas listened to it all, his heart pounding in his chest. The prosecution made a strong case, documenting Morrison's disobedience of orders and the brutality of the attack. The defense argued that Morrison had acted to protect American settlers from savage enemies, that the Apache were a threat that needed to be dealt with by any means necessary. It was the same old argument, the one that had been used to justify violence against native peoples for hundreds of years. On the evening of the 3rd day, the verdict was announced. Thomas held his breath as the presiding officer stood and read from a piece of paper in his hands. Captain James Morrison, the officer said, "You have been found guilty of disobeying direct orders, of conducting an unauthorized military operation, and of causing the deaths of non-combatants in a time of peace. You are hereby sentenced to death by hanging. The sentence will be carried out at dawn in 3 days." A murmur ran through the crowd. Thomas felt a wave of relief wash over him, so intense that he had to grip the edge of his seat to keep from falling. It had worked. Justice had been served. The chief's condition had been met. He rode out that night, heading for the mountains where the Apache were waiting. He pushed his horse harder than ever before, driven by an urgency that bordered on desperation. He had to tell the chief before anyone else did. He had to make sure the chief understood that the promise had been kept, that the murderer would pay for his crimes. He reached the Apache camp just as the sun was setting on the second day. The warriors let him through without challenge, having received word that he was coming. He found the chief sitting alone by a fire, staring into the flames with the same empty expression he had worn when Thomas last saw him. Thomas dismounted and walked toward him. "It is done," he said. "Morrison has been found guilty. He will be executed at dawn tomorrow." The chief looked up at him. His expression did not change, but something shifted in his eyes, some small movement that might have been hope or might have been simply acknowledgement. "You kept your word," the chief said. "The colonel kept his word," Thomas replied. "I only carried the message." The chief shook his head. "No," he said. "You did more than that. You stood between our peoples when no one else would. You risked your life to bring peace. I do not forget such things." He rose to his feet and extended his hand. Thomas took it, and they stood there for a long moment, two men who had been enemies becoming something more. "There will be no war," the chief said. "Not today, not because of this. But you must understand something, my friend. This is only a pause, not an end. The white men will keep coming, and eventually, we will have to fight. It is our nature, and it is our right. When that day comes, I hope you will not be standing on the other side." Thomas nodded. He understood. The peace they had achieved was fragile, temporary. But it was still peace, and it was worth fighting for. He stayed in the Apache camp for one more night, and this time, things were different. The hostility he had felt before was gone, replaced by something that felt almost like acceptance. Warriors who had refused to look at him now nodded in greeting as he passed. Women who had turned their backs on him now offered him food and drink. Even Lozan seemed to have softened, her eyes no longer carrying that cold distance that had hurt him so much. That night, they sat together by the fire and talked. Not about the attack or the trial or the uncertain future, but about simpler things. About the changing of the seasons and the movements of the stars. About childhood memories and dreams for the future. About all the things that people talk about when they want to remember what it means to be alive. It was not the same as before, Thomas knew. The innocence they had shared was gone, replaced by something harder, more knowing. But it was still friendship, still connection. And in a world that seemed determined to tear people apart, that was no small thing. When morning came, Thomas said his goodbyes and headed back toward his ranch. The ride was long, but he barely noticed. His mind was full of everything that had happened, everything that might still happen. He did not know what the future held, but he knew that he had done something good. He had helped prevent a war. He had saved lives on both sides. He had proven that it was possible for people from different worlds to find common ground. It was not enough, he knew. It would never be enough. But it was something. And sometimes, something was all you could ask for. 5 years passed after the execution of Captain Morrison, and in that time, Thomas Redfield watched the world he knew slowly begin to change. The territory was growing.